pull these together. So welcome everybody, and thank you again all for joining from wherever you are in the world. I can see we've got Canadians and Kenyans and folks from the US for sure, and likely other places as well. I think many of you know, but my name is Adrian Gardner. I'm the Executive Director of the Ampath Consortium and the Director of the IU Center for Global Health. I'm joining you here from Indianapolis. And for the last 7 or 8 years was based in Eldoret, Kenya as the field director, and where we had weekly fireside chats at IU House that we were just reflecting on, a space to learn and reflect with our trainees and visitors. And this has really been going on since the 1990s, and we've taken advantage of the technology that exists to try and keep something going, or a little bit modified, as Paula says, but it is an opportunity to sort of still bring people together in a space and share that common space. So today we're going to be talking about orphans and vulnerable children, and hearing from Dr. Paula Breitstein and Dr. David Ayuku and some of their team. As many of you know, Ampath leads with care and taking responsibility for the health of the community where we work. Children make up nearly half of Kenya's population, and they certainly have unique needs. As I said, today we're focusing on orphans and vulnerable children, the population that Ampath has increasingly served over the years. Especially during the HIV pandemic, we saw a tremendous need for serving HIV positive and HIV affected children who lost one or both parents. We have more than 6,000 children active in HIV care in our program, and of course, tens of thousands of quote orphans and vulnerable children served. This group has been the target of dedicated funding from PEPFAR and USAID, and in fact, Ampath with Moi University as the prime just received a $38 million award to support OVC services in 5 counties in Western Kenya. And this support will allow us to support about 160,000 children, not just with medical care, but with the other services they need, nutrition and shelter and counseling and some of the social support that they need to thrive. And while those numbers are big, each one is a life, with an individual story. And I know many of you have visited Eldoret and have witnessed that. Of course, there are also many vulnerable and marginalized children and adolescents that don't necessarily meet the PEPFAR technical definition of an orphan and vulnerable child. And Ampath has done a lot of work to address those needs as well, with the Sarah Allen and all her work in the Sally Test Child Life effort, and today's guests as well. Dr. Breitstein and Dr. Ayuku have really taken on this challenge. So we're lucky to have them with us. So just to do a little bit more for the formal introduction, again, many of you know them, but Ampath, Paula Breitstein is a Ampath researcher and advocate and dear friend, and Professor David Ayuku, professor of clinical psychology at Moi University, are here today to share lessons from years of research on orphanages and care centers in Western Kenya. In Kenya since really 2007, Dr. Breitstein's work is centered on HIV prevention, treatment, and care in sub-Saharan Africa and vulnerable and marginalized children and adolescents, including orphans and street-involved children and youth. She's an associate professor in the Dalai Lama School of Public Health, University of Toronto, a visiting professor at Moi University School of Medicine, and an adjunct professor in the Fairbanks School of Public Health at Indiana University. She is the principal investigator, along with her counterpart, Dr. Ayuku, of a 10-year NIH-supported observational cohort study examining the effects of care environments and care characteristics on orphan children, called OSCAR, the Orphan and Separated Children's Assessment Related to Their Health and Wellbeing Study. And she'll be sharing many of those findings and lessons learned from that research. And as I said, she's joined by her colleagues, David Ayuku, and hopefully Dominic McCory, who's a social worker with the project and currently supporting some work with peer navigators. Just to remind everyone, if you could stay muted and just put questions and comments in the chat throughout, then we will try and address as many of those as possible. So, thank you very much, and over to you, Paula.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrian. That was a nice introduction. I'm glad you mentioned the Ampath leading with care. I think it's fair to say that Professor Ayuku and I took a bit of a different path or interpretation of what that meant, because this whole study, the OSCAR study, is all about the home care environment as opposed to the healthcare environment, but it's still very much part and parcel of leading with care. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So as I'm sure many of you know, there were nearly 140 million orphan children globally in 2015, including 52 million in Africa. Globally, 15.1 million are double orphans, and 16.6 have been orphaned by HIV/AIDS, of whom 90% live in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the majority of orphaned and separated children and adolescents, or OSCA, are cared for by a surviving parent or extended family. And these are mostly the targets of the Ampath OVC program, at least the ones who were orphaned and made vulnerable by HIV. But there are so many children requiring care on the subcontinent. This has really led to a proliferation of institutional care, meaning orphanages and rescue centers. And so recent research estimates there are 650,000 to 1.4 million OSCA living in institutional care in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this study kind of takes place in the context of the global drive for de-institutionalization. So I'm sure many of you remember the stories that came out of Eastern Europe, I think in the 90s and maybe 80s, I lose track of time, but pictures on the cover of New York Times and so on, showing that these government-run orphanages were absolutely abysmal, horrible places for children. Children being chained to their cribs and not allowed to move, and like totally not cared for. And there have been a lot of studies now out of Eastern Europe demonstrating deficits and delays in physical growth, psychological health, and cognitive and developmental outcomes in children living in institutional care. In Canada, in particular, but I suspect the same is true in the US and Australia, the government started what we call residential schools for Indigenous children, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed into these quote unquote residential homes, where they experienced profound levels of abuse and trauma and cultural genocide and deaths. And, there were like severe cultural breaks, and Indigenous communities today are still coping with the effects. The last residential school, I think, only closed in the late 1970s or something like that. And so a lot of the abuse that is experienced in Indigenous communities is directly as a result of these institutional care environments. And then, of course, there's, Oliver Twist. And so what most people think about when they think of an orphanage, the first image that comes to many people's mind is of Oliver Twist, basically with his bowl, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And so, the idea basically being that the institution is a setting of deprivation and hardship and suffering for children. And this has certainly been the case across much of even Western Europe and the UK, and of course, Eastern Europe. So there's like a mountain of evidence about how bad institutions are and orphanages are for children. And as a result of this massive body of evidence, international organizations backed by influential donors and foundations, including USAID and UNICEF and Save the Children, and Lumos, which is the foundation operated by the author of Harry Potter, have advocated really pushing for a global policy of de-institutionalization. And what's happening at the moment is that national de-institutionalization policies are being mandated by countries, including Kenya, right, by USAID, UNICEF, and others, as a condition of receiving any aid. And so in order for countries like Kenya to continue to receive aid from the UK or the US or whatever, they have to have on the books a national policy of deinstitutionalization. And so this is kind of the context in which this study is taking place, because the national and county children's officers here are, in theory, supposed to be closing institutions. But what's happening is that the number of children who need a safety net, who need care and protection, is so high that it's really very much needed. We already know that families in low and middle income countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, have very high dependency ratios, and Africa has the highest dependency ratios of anywhere in the world, meaning that for every employed person, the number of dependents that they have to look after is the highest. Okay, it's a ratio. And so families aren't able to, meet the traditional caretaking expectations of them. And so this is a problem, and it results in a lot of children going to the street. We've also established through systematic reviews and meta-analyses and primary research that the major drivers to the street of children are extreme poverty, family conflict, and child abuse. And in a country like Kenya, as I'm sure many of you are aware, foster care is really underdeveloped. And the county children's officers are already quite overwhelmed with the number of children who, need protection and removal from their families and so on. And then you have all these orphans in addition. There are also cultural reasons why orphan children are not necessarily always well looked after within an extended family. And, of course, families are already very stretched, right? So they try to do what they can, but it's very, very challenging. And so we really do need contextually relevant, rigorous, and longitudinal evidence to inform safe and effective care and support policies and interventions for orphaned and separated children and adolescents. And that includes, what does safe and effective de-institutionalization look like? Because of course the problem is, an institution is closed, and then you have to ask the question, okay, well then what happens? Where are the children going and how are they ending up? And there's a real lack of comparative evidence of the experience, the health and welfare of orphans living in different care environments. So with Professor Ayuku and several others, we started this project called OSCAR. So OSCAR started actually in 2009. And we wanted to understand the effect of the care environment of orphaned and separated children from all causes, not just HIV, on their physical health, their mental health, and other things like the meeting of their basic material needs and child abuse and neglect, for example. We sought initially to describe models of care for this population and to investigate the effect of care environment on these key indicators. And because what we were finding overall was that the children in the institutions were doing better, at least at enrollment, okay, what we wanted to do with phase 2 was try to understand why that was and explain it and measure the cost effectiveness of different care environments. So just to give you a little bit of context, in Kenya, we call orphanages and rescue centers charitable children's institutions if they're caring for at least 20 children, okay, in their home or facility. So when we started the study in 2009 in Uasin Gishu, there were 21 CCIs, one declined to participate and one didn't care for orphans. And as a result of that first view, we were able to kind of categorize CCIs into 3 different types. The pure CCIs, where all they do is like basically take care of the children who are living in there. CCI plus, where the CCI takes care of the children living in there, but also is providing educational support or subsidies or other kinds of aid to maybe households in the community surrounding the CCI. And CCI shelter, which is basically like the rescue center, for example, where it's kind of like a place of last resort for children, and where there's no other option except essentially being on the street. And then 3 other kinds of sort of CCIs we were able to characterize were village style, like what you see in this photo, whereby you have each CCI kind of being organized in a village type of a thing, where each of these households is basically kind of run or led by, a mother and a father. Usually they're married to each other, and they may have their own children or not. And then they have like 15 to 20 children as well, kind of in their family. And then there are multiple of those, like, for example, this is Lamoru. Testimony is another example of that, if you know Testimony. And they operate kind of as a village. There's the single family dwelling, where you have like one couple who basically has many children living with them in a big house. And then you have dormitory style, which is, for example, at least at the time, like Neema, for example, which caters for children living with HIV, and where children are basically usually separated maybe by age and sex, but otherwise they sleep kind of in a dormitory style. So we included 300 households caring for orphan separated children and adolescents from 6 locations, and these were selected randomly, okay? And we used a whole sampling frame. You can, if you're interested, you can check it out in this paper that I referenced down here. And we included a convenient sample of 100 street-connected children and youth in Eldoret, okay, or street youth. Because what we were trying to do was to compare children living in institutions with children living with extended families, right? But then we wanted to also involve street children because they're effectively taking care of themselves. So they represent the care environment we call self-care, okay? And we really had no idea if we were going to be able to follow this population longitudinally. So it was a small sample, a convenient sample, and you'll see the results, okay? So these are some key acronyms you might see: CCI, Charitable Children's Institutions, FBC or FBS, Family-Based Care, Family-Based Setting, and SCY, Street Connected Children and Youth. So what I'm going to actually present to you are some of our kind of final outcomes that are either just published recently or like on the burner and hopefully published in the coming months, okay? So let's start with educational outcomes. You know, ensuring quality education for this population is essential, obviously, to their future health and well-being, and it is also their fundamental human right. So we evaluated primary school completion, secondary school completion, and partial secondary school completion only in the children living in the CCIs and the family-based settings. And what we found was that 76% of OSCA over the age of 14 had completed primary school, while 32% of them over the age of 18 had completed secondary school. And compared to children living in the family-based settings, the children in the CCIs were 12% more likely to have completed primary school, and 46% less likely to have completed all 4 years of secondary school, but actually 28% more likely to have completed at least 1 year of secondary school. Now, these findings are very intriguing, and they're intriguing because what they kind of speak to is the fact that children, once they turn 18, they're pretty much forcibly deinstitutionalized and kind of sent out, not usually by the institutions themselves, but because it's the law, right, that they exit from the CCI because now they're 18, they're supposed to be adults. So what's happening, as far as we can see, is that they're more likely to finish primary school, they're more likely to get any secondary school, but they're less likely to be able to finish it because they're deinstitutionalized before they're able to. Nutritional status involved all 3 of the populations. At baseline, participants in the households were 2.6 times more likely to be stunted than those in the CCIs. The street youth were 5.9 times more likely to be stunted than the children in the CCIs. And there were no differences at baseline in weight or height, weight for height or weight for age or BMI. But in follow-up, we see some differences. Now, at the last site assessment that we did, 81% of CCIs and 10% of households reported being food secure. So already you can see a massive difference in the 2 care environments in terms of their, sense of food security. Participants in CCIs were less likely to transition from not stunted to stunted. They were also less likely to remain stunted once stunted, but they were very much more likely to transition from not wasted to wasted and more likely to remain wasted once wasted. And we actually aren't sure how to interpret these findings. What we do know is that there was a pretty big drought, as some of you will know, in 2008-9, and this may well have had an impact on the food security. It was also sort of following the time of the global economic crisis, the previous global economic crisis. And this, of course, had impacts on families and institutions here. A lot of the institutions depend on donors from the US and elsewhere, right, for funding. And so even they're experiencing it now. As the disposable income dries up in high income countries among donors, right, that translates into less money on this side as well. Now, an important finding from this is actually around the boy child, because we found very consistently that males were more likely than females in both phases of the study, irrespective of care environment, to transition from not stunted to stunted, to remain stunted once stunted, to, transition from not wasted to wasted, and to remain wasted once already wasted. Okay. So this is something important that I think people can take away right away, right? Is that we need to not forget about the boys. Now, mental health. So just to give you a bit of context, the effective care environment on Oska's mental health is not very well characterized. There is very little, if any, longitudinal data. And we compared the risk of PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicidality between the three populations again, okay, over the full 10 years of the cohort. And this was published by Professor Atwoli's mentee, Dr. Felicito Omari, in BMJ Global Health just a couple of months ago. So we included 1,931 participants aged 10 and up, because we only did the mental health assessments on the kids who were 10 and up. 52% were male at enrollment with an average age of 13, and over half of them were double orphans. So over time, compared to those in the family-based environments, Oska and CCIs were less likely to be diagnosed with PTSD, less likely rather to be diagnosed with depression, less likely to be diagnosed with anxiety, and less likely to be diagnosed as suicidal. Okay. However, street youth were significantly more likely to be diagnosed with all of those things compared to children living in the family-based setting. And these results are adjusted for age, sex, orphan status, clustering, length of time in the care environment, and their mental health at baseline. Okay. Now, this might be because there are trained counselors in some of these, in most of these institutions, right? Maybe it's because if they're coming out of a traumatic environment, family-based setting, for example, right? Then they're able to start to heal from that once they're in a safe environment. There are a number of explanations that we aren't able to pinpoint because these are observational data. But we basically find, a similar kind of a trend with child abuse and neglect. So much of the literature suggests that child abuse is much worse than CCIs, but much of the literature is actually not at all comparative. So for example, there will be a study saying in this institution or in these three institutions, this many children had experienced abuse and neglect. But how does that compare to children living in extended families, the same population living in extended families? More kind of reasonable interpretation than what you can interpret from a single site or non-comparative study. I hope you can hear me. It's raining here, and I'm under our iron sheet roof, so I'm just going to keep trying to talk more loudly. So this analysis includes 2,393 participants aged 18 years and below. And the primary outcome of interest was recent sexual abuse, physical, mental, or sexual, meaning that it was experienced in the previous 6 months. Now, 47% of this population overall reported ever experiencing any kind of recent abuse at baseline, and 54% of them reported experiencing it recently in follow-up, okay? So the abuse and neglect being experienced by this population, like in general, is like huge. It's a really substantial burden of abuse. It's a real problem. But compared to those in the faith-based, in the family-based settings, street youth were much more likely to have reported prevalence of all types of recent abuse at baseline, in follow-up, and cumulatively over time, whereas the OSCAs in institutional care were no more likely than those in the family-based settings to report any recent abuse at baseline or incident abuse in follow-up. Which is to say that at least the children in the institutions are not doing worse than those in the family-based settings, but all of them overall are experiencing, like, this is like 1 out of 2 kids, right? Like in the last 6 months experiencing physical, mental, or sexual abuse. This is a big deal. So we're finalizing the analysis now, looking at sexual reproductive health outcomes over time. We found at enrollment that participants in the CCIs were less likely than those in the family-based settings to have engaged in transactional sex or to have experienced forced sex, okay? Which is important because we know that orphans are more likely to acquire HIV, right, in adolescence compared to non-orphans. And it's probably because they're having to exchange sex for material goods, money, protection, all kinds of things, right? Because they're living in highly deprived environments. So we think that if they're in less deprived environments, they're going to be less likely to have to exchange in transactional sex, which puts them in better positions, less vulnerable to experiencing forced sex. But the children in the institutions were more likely to have had more than one partner, and they were not more or less likely to have ever had sex. Now, in follow-up, almost half of these participants reported having ever had sex, although in follow-up, those in CCIs were less likely to have ever had sex. Okay, so in other words, when they come into the institution, they have an equal probability of having had sex. But in follow-up, among the ones who have not had sex, okay, the ones in the CCIs are less likely to have started having sex, but more likely to have had their first sex in early adolescence. They're less likely to be pregnant and neither more nor less likely to have had transactional sex, which doesn't really support what I was proposing before, but you know, there it is. So the street youth, although they're not more likely to have ever had sex, but they're far more likely to have had sex in early adolescence, and they're far more likely to have had transactional sex, which speaks to mortality in HIV. So there is literally no longitudinal data on mortality or HIV incidence in orphans or street youth in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, which I still find kind of astounding because these populations are so large and obviously so high risk. So our objective was to compare the HIV and mortality risk among OSCA living in CCIs, family-based settings, and on the street over a 10-year period. And we were able to include 2,500, just over 2,500 participants in this analysis. Excuse me, there were 59 participants who acquired HIV or died during the time. Now, this is a Kaplan-Meier curve. So I'm just going to slowly take you through it, okay? On the vertical axis here, 1.0 means 100% of them are alive and without HIV, okay? And then over time on the x-axis, so this shows you the 9-10 years of follow-up. You can see the children in green here, the children in the CCIs, okay, have the lowest incidence of HIV and mortality together, okay? And then the next one is that the children living in the family-based settings have more mortality, okay? But compared to the street youth, and these dotted lines, these are the confidence intervals, okay? But then you can see the street youth have like a hugely greater probability of dying and acquiring HIV compared to either of the two other populations. So after adjusting for gender and baseline HIV status, the OSCA and CCIs versus the households versus the family-based settings were 77% less likely to die and neither more nor less likely to acquire HIV, okay? But compared to the children in the family-based setting, street youth were 7 times more likely to die, 21 times more likely to acquire HIV, and overall 10 times more likely to die or acquire HIV. So, I think these are very important data, and they speak to a very large population of children who Professor Ayuku has been trying to engage them for, at least 20 years, and has been very successful in all kinds of ways. But the number of street children out there is very large. I'm not going to speak to that today, but we really need to try to do more. So we tried to understand the relationship between care environment, resilience, and social factors, thinking that maybe the explanation for why we were seeing the impact of care environment on the outcomes was because the CCIs maybe do a better job of promoting resilience, right, in their environment. So for example, the children are more likely to be engaged in sports or church activities, or the fact that they have more psychosocial support or whatever. And so we tested this actually. And my PhD student, Sarah Sutherland in University of Toronto, has taken on this whole piece for her dissertation work, and she's making good progress there. So we wanted to look specifically at factors thought to promote resilience, like social, family, and peer support, and then the relationship between resilience and these same resilience promoting factors, okay? And basically what we found in general was that the mean resilience score in the CCIs was in fact higher, and that the OSCA and CCIs did actually have more social support and peer support than those in the family-based settings. At the same time, family, social, and peer relationships were positively associated with resilience in all analyses, okay? And OSCA and the CCIs were also much more likely to volunteer doing something, and this volunteering was positively associated with resilience. The factor most strongly related to resilience in both fully adjusted models was actually peer support. And so all of the work that many people are doing, actually including ourselves, around peer support, peer navigation, all of that kind of thing, probably, according to these data, has a very high probability of helping to cultivate resilience in young people. Now, one of the things that is always assumed is that an institution is not a family. But what we've witnessed is that a lot of the CCIs, at least in Wazingishu, really try hard to create a sense of family within them. And so we had a postdoctoral fellow come and do some qualitative anthropological research, actually, to try and understand kinship and family ties in the institutions and how these are kind of constructed within that environment in order to try and help the kids. So what we found was that the social interaction with the caregivers contributed meaning towards the definition of family within some CCIs, particularly those which were modeled after a village and or a single family, as I kind of described those models to you earlier on. A family-like care environment was created, resulting in OSCA's redefining the traditional concept of family based on consanguinity to one composed of non-kin providing care and support. And social interaction through family-related activities like eating and praying produced novel familial identities, and some OSCA felt they were part of a quasi-family. However, the OSCAs lacked autonomy. They feared the consequences of not following the rules of behavior and felt re-traumatized and re-abandoned when they exited from the CCI at age 18. So for example, we had a situation at some point where there was a girl within a CCI who we thought might be pregnant. Now, fortunately, the pregnancy test was negative, but if she had been pregnant, she would have been actually pushed out of the CCI. If children don't, at least for some institutions, if they don't believe in God, or if they're not Christian, or they don't want to go to church or that kind of thing, they're basically not allowed to stay. So being in an institution, you know, because there are so many kids, right, for whom being in one of these places would be like, you know, a good thing, and they would prefer it. But so the CCIs are in a position where they can really like pick and choose what kind of kids they want. And as any of you with kids will know, you know, kids need to be allowed to make mistakes, right? Like a family, we're there for our kids when they make mistakes. And we might punish them, yes, but you know, even if we sometimes send them out of the house, go have a timeout of 3 months. Or, no, I'm kidding. But you know, but they're still part of the family, right? And that is an important difference with the CCIs. Now, led by Omar Galarraga and his PhD student, Martha Wilson Barth at Brown, we basically undertook a cost effectiveness study looking at the mental health outcomes, okay? And what we wanted to do was essentially evaluate the cost effectiveness of CCIs compared to family-based settings in terms of the dollar per unit reduction in mental health diagnoses and quality adjusted life years gained. Okay, so we were able to get cost data from 9 of the institutions, which were the sort of like typical CCIs. So for example, the Rescue Center was not included in this. And 225 of the 300 family-based settings in the Oscar cohort, and calculated monthly per child costs. And this paper will hopefully appear in this journal very soon. It's presently under re-review. And essentially found that CCIs cost on average $114 more than family-based settings in terms of monthly per child expenditures. But they resulted in incremental cost effectiveness ratios of, you know, modest amounts per unit reduction in depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicidal diagnosis among OSCA. The incremental cost for additional quality adjusted life year was 1,140. The probability of CCIs being more cost effective than family-based settings was greater than 90% for willingness to pay thresholds. And they conclude that compared to family-based settings, institutions may actually be more cost effective for improving mental health outcomes among orphaned and separated children and adolescents. When they're still working on this analysis, but so far, basically, they've done the same thing, trying to look at the cost effectiveness relative to HIV infection or death, and find that even when they use a per cap threshold of 3 times Kenya's gross domestic product, right, that CCIs are not looking to be more cost effective than family-based settings for preventing HIV or death. Which helps us to understand how best, you know, that CCIs can be used, you know, to find the niche kind of role and responsibility of them in the context of, you know, in the context of caring for orphaned and separated children. Like children who have serious mental health issues might do better, at least for a while, to stay in an institution. Okay, sorry, Rudy, not now. So some takeaway messages. CCIs in Uasin Gishu were, because we stopped collecting data, I guess 2 years ago, doing well for the children in their care relative to the OSCA and family-based settings, and especially compared to street youth. Street youth are incredibly vulnerable and high risk for multiple morbidities and mortality, and are in need of immediate protection and care. Family-based settings need to be greatly strengthened along with child protection systems in Kenya before deinstitutionalization of children can become universal. Because at this stage, what will happen, or what is happening, is the institutions are closed. Most of these kids actually, they might technically have family, biological family, but those biological family are not in a position to care for them or to care for them well. They might be extremely poor, they might be abusive, they might be like have evil stepmothers in them. You know, the children didn't end up in the institutions because they were coming from happy, healthy families, right? They came because they were in need of a safety net. And so for many of these kids, the street is really their only other option. So these are our recommendations that we came up with after phase one. And actually, they're all still true. And the first one is that all models of care are necessary to cope with what we call an epidemic of orphaned and vulnerable children. Okay, so, ideally, you have the child living with their mother or father, okay, whoever is remaining. And if that's not possible, with extended family. But there's huge opportunity to build up community-based care and support programs, like, for example, the government cash transfer supporting OVC, to provide support and care to families caring for orphan children. I didn't show you these data, but we did find that, the majority of institutions get large amounts of their income from, for example, faith-based organizations in the US, right? Or just churches generally, that the households, the families caring for orphans in the community had almost no external material support. And so there's a lot of room for growth in that. The care and support for adolescents is a major gap that needs to be filled. So as I was talking about institutions being able to pick and choose, they pick and choose such that they tend to take younger children when at all possible. Because, as any of you who have an adolescent at home or have had an adolescent at home, adolescents are a challenge, right? And who needs a challenge when you've got 80 or 100 kids that you have to look after? Okay, that's already a challenge in itself. Foster care needs to be hugely expanded and strengthened in this country. And as I said, community-based supports for families and caregivers, like cash subsidies, education and training, like parenting training of caregivers and guardians, investments in child education, and drug and alcohol treatment for children and adults, because a lot of the problems that children experience is because of addiction issues by the adults in the household. Supporting the family will support the children. But just to update some of our recommendations a little bit, advocacy is needed now to build on these data and other evidence, actually, to try to immediately suspend the national de-institutionalization policy in Kenya. It's just not feasible. And every day the county children's officers are having to drop off more children at the CCIs because they have nowhere else to put them, right? Community-based programs, including drop-in centers and healthcare, need to be implemented urgently to help protect and support street youth. The cash transfer program for orphans and vulnerable children should be scaled up as much as possible, and it should include single mothers and street youth. The program tends to only include double orphans, but single orphans, particularly the maternal ones, are also extremely vulnerable. While CCIs have potential for deleterious effects, in our context, they're part of the solution more than they are part of the problem. So we have a number of next steps that I guess it looks like I won't be able to take on anytime soon, but we have a lot of questions, including the longer term sexual and reproductive health outcomes, the impact of COVID-19 on the outcomes of children living in these different care environments, how resilience can be cultivated in any care environment, and then a whole swath of research needs to happen around de-institutionalization. Who can be safely de-institutionalized? How can it be done safely and effectively? And what are the outcomes of those who have already been de-institutionalized? There is no data on any of these things across sub-Saharan Africa. So I just want to thank a whole bunch of people, including every single CCI director, staff member, and child resident who participated in this study. All the participants and their guardians in the community, the county children's officers, the Wazingishu Children's Services Forum, the Oscar staff and volunteers, and of course, all the Oscar co-investigators from both phase 1 and 2, and of course, the NIH for actually funding 2 phases of this study. And a special shout out to our friend and colleague, Alan Commanda, who was the project manager for Oscar for the entire period, and he was fantastic. and he died of COVID. I guess what, 6 weeks ago now, and we really miss him terribly. Sorry, Alan. Really, he was supposed to be here with us. That was the plan. And then at the end, just for your reference, I've included some of the publications that have come out of the study so that you can consult those if you want more information about anything I've talked about. And that's all I have for you. Okay, we still have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your support over the many years, many of you who I've come to interact with, and please, let's open it up.
Thanks so much, Paula. David, did you want to say a word before we? There's lots of chatter a lot of questions and comments in the chat that we can get to, but I just want to give you an opportunity to.
No, I just wanted to comment on 2008 and 2009. I think that was the period that we were having clashes again. Other than the international economic issues, we had a lot of problems in Kenya that period between 2007 and 9.
Yeah.
So it contributed to the problems we have now.
Good point. Yeah. So Paula, I don't know if you can see the chat. I think the first question was really just a clarification on your Kaplan-Meier curve about, it sounds like you were treating sort of HIV acquisition and survival as a sort of single composite endpoint rather than individually, but just seeking clarity on that, I think.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So that was my question, Paula. So what, can you break it down at all? Or do you
Hi,
know?
Eleanor.
Hi there, good to see you. Any idea?
Sure.
Yeah, great.
Sure. So at time 0, right? At time 0, they're all alive. Okay, with me so far?
Absolutely, yeah.
Time 0, they're all alive and HIV negative.
Okay.
And then over time, so you can see where this is the CCIs, about what, 97, 98% of them are still alive and still HIV negative.
Okay, so
Okay.
Okay, yeah. All right, I get it now. And with the blue part,
children in the family-based settings is more like maybe 95% of them are still alive and HIV negative.
okay,
And the
so
street children,
yeah.
like 78%, say, are alive and HIV negative.
So all the deaths are related to HIV. I guess that's what I needed clarification.
Not necessarily. No. Then it depends. Like if they were HIV positive before they died, then they would have been censored at the time they acquired HIV.
Okay.
In the analysis.
So it's HIV or death as the outcome.
That makes sense to you.
It's HIV or death. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, now HIV or death, right? You're welcome. Okay, now I can't see the rest of the chats again until somebody chats.
Maybe Cheryl, could I ask you to sort of come off mute just because your comments are really insightful, but if you could summarize them or.
Sure. Hi, this is Cheryl Keach. Hi, thank you very much for the presentation, Paula. It's very interesting. We've been, very supportive and interested in this area for a long time. My comment is around some comments you made around CCIs versus family-based units, and observations, I would say personal observations as well as research, I think, has shown that, a family-based unit is quite variable as well. And there's very little oversight into how those family-based units are controlled. There's certainly been nutritional, insights that have shown kids are ostracized within a family-based unit as well. There's a hierarchy, there's intolerance as well that can happen in family-based units. And I don't think we can say that there's more intolerance in a CCI than in a family-based unit, because I think there's less data on the family-based units and there's probably more variability across family-based units. And my question on CCIs is that they look very, very positive. and for the value they bring. Certainly, you know, decentralizing those is going to have a major negative impact because they're all going to go to street kids. You know, that's where they're going to fall. And so that's obviously a big negative. But when we think about CCIs and having a single CCI across full range groups, even when we think about, you know, societies where we all live, we don't put all those kids together forever because they do change and evolve. And so maybe the CCIs have a potential to evolve as you go to adolescence and into early adulthood, that you're supporting that level. You can't apply the same rules and you can't apply the same methodologies, obviously, to that huge age group. And is there a potential actually to grow the CCI in a way that we take those adolescents and build them into more independent, you know, build on the resilience that they're seeing, build on that community that they have, and build that into young adulthood, and not keep them in the same units where we have 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. It doesn't work then. We know that. We even know in our family units, we have to change how we deal with older kids than younger kids. And we send kids off, and many young adolescents or young adulthoods, they don't live in isolation. They're not just kicked out the door and then they're on their own. They go into a transition plan, whether that's going and living with, you know, roommates, and whether that's going and living on college campuses. But there's a transition plan that all young adults have to go through and still have community. I think right now, maybe what's missing is that transition plan, because now we've got enough kids that are to that age of having a transition. And I'd like to know your thoughts on, is there a gap there? And could that gap be solved in a different way than using the same units that we have for the young kids?
Thank you, Cheryl. There's a lot in there. So maybe first, just to clarify, I wasn't trying to say that institutions are less tolerant of bad behavior than families necessarily, but they can draw the lines a lot harder and enforce them maybe a little more than families can. You know, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not very common for people to send their, like, get out of the house and don't come back. Like that's rare. And just because it's culturally not acceptable. It's probably a little different with the orphans, but we're working on an analysis right now, actually looking at intra-household discrimination, comparing children in the households with children in the CCIs, because it exists in both places. So that's a fair point. And, you know, I think, so the Tumaini Children's Center isn't really, they might be a registered CCI now, but they weren't at the time that we started the study. So they weren't participating in this, but they're the only organization, the only CCI type thing that I know that caters to adolescents and adolescent street boys at that. And so there's, I mean, I think it's a great idea that to have, like, you know, care environments that are really specialized for adolescents, like a lot of the group homes, for example, in North America are, in recognition of their growing independence and their changing development and so on. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, and there's a lot of potential for, like, transition plans. And a lot of the CCIs I know were trying to bridge that gap for the children the kids who have aged out, basically, but are still needing support. But I don't know how effective it is, and I don't know how systematic it is. So yeah, those are really great points.
Yeah, I think just one other comment, Adrian and Paula, is just, you know, it might be a tipping point finally, which is a good tipping point, that we have enough young population in Kenya that has grown and matured in a way that they've, number one, survived HIV, number one, they have resilience. But it doesn't mean that because they turn 18, all of a sudden they're ready to go out in the world on their own, right? They've had a tough life, and they've had to accommodate a lot of things, as have the CCIs and family-based units. But because there's this ability now that they can become productive adults, and they do have the ability to enter into society and have a great chance, there still has to be a transition plan made for them. It just doesn't happen automatically, right? But maybe there's a time now that there's a big enough population that needs that the Kenyan government and others can see this is a very positive thing to be able to get, so many orphans now into productive adult society in a very positive way. But it can't just happen with just you turned 18 or something else has happened in your life and you've decided to get married and now off you go. Because I think they probably don't have they're probably not ready for that, right? And there's so many of them. Like, how's that gonna actually?
Professor Ayuku, would you like to comment on this? You're on the board, in fact, of Tumaini, so you're a little closer to it than I am.
Yeah, so Tumaini, we are trying to do what we are just talking about, but I think the problem is that if you have been on the streets, although you get some training, vocational training to earn some money to survive on, because at Tumaini they are training them how to make vehicles and to be mechanics and all that. But now the problem is, how do you transit from Tumaini to Juakali? Juakali is the informal sector in Kenya. If you have not been part of the informal sector, it's very hard to get in. So, and the government has tried that in 2000. The new NAC government tried that, and they trained so many street children in carpentry and mechanical and all that. The reason they didn't make it is when they came back to the town, they were discriminated because everybody said they are chokoras and they are or street children, so they can't be trusted to work for people. And that's still the major problem now. So if you have been an orphan and you don't get supported through the Juakali sector so that you become a member of that community, it's very hard to be trained in an institution. Then now you go there and you want to be part of it. So that's the transitional part that is still a major problem that need to be tackled. So even Tumaini, we are trying to do that so that when they train them, they try to get the kids to, or the street youth to start working with the Juakali sector so that they get used to each other before we let them go. Yes.
Thanks. Paul, yeah, go ahead. Paul and David, it's just an incredible portfolio of work and just, amazing. I'm happy to sort of extend for a few more minutes if people have time. There were some questions around the government response, just in general to this issue, and maybe particularly around what you see happening with COVID, whether this is going to further exacerbate the conditions for these vulnerable kids.
Prof, I'll let you handle that.
Well, the government has tried, but now I don't think they have too many issues that they are dealing with. So there's, like last night, I think so many children were beaten up by on the street, the ones who are still on the street. So some of them have been hospitalized. But COVID is creating more problem because more people are being unemployed or they have lost their employment. Most hotels that the children were eating, they have closed. So it is creating a lot of more problem than before. So it is a major problem now. Unemployment, lack of money, and closing businesses that the street children were being involved in. So COVID is a major problem. I can just say that.
And what about the effect on the CCIs, Prof? Is it affecting them as well in terms of congregate living situations?
Yeah, CCIs, I think they, other than financially, they are still doing okay. Yeah, so because they are being supported from international communities, and now the problem is some of those supporters or sponsors are not able to remit the money for running those CCIs. So it's now becoming again an issue because the locally we are unable to support those CCIs.
In terms of the
As far as I know, COVID hasn't gotten into the CCI's like congregate settings here yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, but
So-
if Dominic, I don't know if he joined, maybe he can give us some light, but I doubt. We have not, I've not heard that they have closed because of the COVID yet.
I'm scouring around. I don't see a Dominic on, but
I don't think he joined. Maybe he had some problem.
yeah.
But I haven't heard that the CCI has closed because of COVID.
Okay. What about the whole sort of de-institutionalization sort of strategy? Is that moving forward now, Paula? Is that in place, or is that a sort of future proposal? Or
It is. Yeah, no, it's in place. And the county children's officers are constantly threatening the institutions with closing them and, really reinforcing again and again, the need to deinstitutionalize children and stuff. They're really under a lot of pressure to close and to get the kids out. So it's, and it translates into a lot of anxiety and stress for the children as well, who know what's going on and, are worried about what's going to happen to them. It's a real problem, and because institutions have such a bad reputation globally, honestly, like people don't want to hear these findings really. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a real challenge because the dominant paradigm is institutions are bad for children, families are good for children. And it's like, it's so much more complicated than that, and so to try to, influence the discourse that's used to talk about institutions in the context of so many millions of children in need is a real challenge, actually.
And just to add on, SOS has closed. I think they have sold their campus.
Really?
So what they are trying to do, is to have houses within the community so that they can still maintain their children that they had adopted and send them to school. But now the whole organization is disintegrating.
Prof, is
that
that
must be what Leslie you're talking about. Yeah.
That's a result of decreased resources, presumably, or?
Part of that, and part of it is that the government pushing them to close.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to look for details. It had come up when we did phone surveys to adolescents who were living with HIV. During the pandemic, during the strict lockdown period, we did phone calls to sort of find out how people were doing, and it was one of the things that came up. So it might have been that same one. I haven't been able to find the details of which one it was.
Well, it sounds like it was SOS.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Oh, thank you, Paula and David. Again, just an incredible portfolio of work, and it's sort of eye-opening to see just how complex this problem is. It's not as simple as sort of the take homes that people like to sort of make it, sort of simplify it. But thank you everyone for tuning in today. And obviously this work like this relies on support of people like you and donations to Ampath. So if you're interested in supporting these initiatives, feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you to the right folks. Our next fireside chat is going to be lessons inspired by Ampath, how a trip to Kenya experiencing care delivery firsthand influenced work and leadership. So there are several members of the IU Health board, actually, the health system here in Indiana, that are going to be reflecting on their experience in a trip in 2019. So that's on May 17th, 12 noon, 7 p.m. Kenya.